Hello, this is the next instalment in the Quest of the White Merle by Lilian Gask, chapter the 10th, The Sun God's Plumes. Masses of coral and curious sponges littered the beach of the Aru Islands, and shells as lovely as those of Enoshima were tangled in the seaweed or encrusted in the sand. Some were rosy all over with the glow of the dawn, while others gleamed with mother of pearl against the dull, bare rocks, as if they had caught an imprisoned array of moonlight. But the shells that interested Conrad most were those that sheltered the hermit crabs. Strewn on the beach in every direction, these were the centre of groups of spiders who made them their staple food. Now and then a particularly fierce creature would carry off a shell for his private enjoyment, his eyes snapping with hungry joy, and there was something so distasteful to Conrad in his crawling legs and fat brown body that he did not stay to admire the sea gardens in the shining pools, but hurried inland, where ferns and creepers and giant orchids tumbled over each other in riotous profusion. Brown lizards and green lizards, hideous black ones with gaping mouths, and funny little grey fellows the exact colour of a dead twig, blinked at him drowsily from the straggling bushes and rotten trunks. They stared so hard that he felt quite shy, but he soon forgot them in his admiration for the bird-winged butterflies with golden bodies and crimson breasts that were hovering over flowers as brilliant as themselves. On the glistening leaves of a luxuriant climber, wee jumping spiders, every colour of the rainbow, reminded him of the beads he had loved to thread when he was a little chap. The robin showed unmistakable signs of wishing to make their closer acquaintance, but Conrad would not hear of it. They seemed gladsome and merry creatures, and he could not bear to see harm to come to them. "Very well," said Gladheart resignedly. "I won't eat the spiders if it hurts your feelings. But that's what spiders are made for, when they are small enough. Why, what has happened now?" Conrad had caught his head in a thick, soft net that hung straight down from a palm tree, about the level of his face above the ground. It was horrible to feel it clinging around him, and, as he freed himself from the glutinous threads, a hideous yellow-spotted monster at least 2 inches across the body, with wiry legs that were all a-quiver with rage, glared at him angrily from the very centre. "You have torn my web," she hissed. "You clumsy creature." "Serves you right, serves you right," whistled a black cockatoo delightedly, as the spider beat an angry retreat. "If she had her way," he went on to Conrad, "she would trap small birds as well as insects in that horrible net of hers. You'd be shocked if you knew as much about her as I do." Conrad looked at him attentively, for his sombre hue was a remarkable contrast to the gorgeous plumage of the other birds, who darted from bough to bough. He had rather a small body, with long and slender wings. His head was extremely large in proportion and decorated with an imposing crest. His blood-red cheeks were bare of feathers, and his great hooked bill, strongly curved and pointed, gave him quite a grotesque appearance. His blue-black plumage was dusted with fine white powder, and though this was in reality the result of imperfect quills, it seemed as if he were covered with delicate bloom. Perched on the lower branches of a stately palm tree, he returned Conrad's gaze with one of equal interest. Quite reassured, he whistled approvingly and hopped onto a bough that was lower still. "My name is Aratul," he remarked, having made up his mind to cross the space between them. "Since you are winged, I suppose we may take it for granted that you come as a friend and would not harm us." "Indeed you may," cried Conrad, looking round to make sure there were no spiders near as he leant against a tree. "I should like a talk with you very much. You're the finest cockatoo that I have ever seen." Aratu's cheeks were so red already that he could not blush if he tried, but he spread out his crest and ducked his head and preened his feathers joyfully. "I wish those conceited cousins of mine, the white cockatoos, could hear you," he said. "You are sure that you have no fire sticks or arrows hidden among your feathers? Forgive me for asking, but I had a narrow escape last season, and I haven't yet got over it. A party of pale-faced men came to these islands and camped close by. My mate and I kept well out of their way, and it was well we did. They were most dangerous creatures." "Were they?" asked Conrad lazily. He was not listening quite as closely as he might have been, for he could not take his eyes away from the vivid blue butterflies and transparent clear-winged moths that circled round the crimson and purple flowers. "Were they?" mimicked the cockatoo. "Well, I should think so. They pointed their sticks at every bird that came within their range, and then, when the beautiful things fell hopeless, stripped off their skins and went away, quite satisfied with their wickedness. The first day they came, it was after the rains, and I had been helping my mate to enlarge a hole in a decaying trunk, so that she might lay her eggs there in comfort. I happened to be roosting in the low branches of the tree under which they rested after their midday meal. They had bits of brown wood stuck in the side of their mouths, and clouds of blue mist with a strange scent came out of these, and were lost amongst the leaves. I should have flown away directly I heard their voices, but they were talking about me, and I was so surprised that I stopped to listen. They had caught a glimpse of me a little earlier as I flew by in my silent way, and one was asking the other why he hadn't fired. I learnt a great deal. About myself that day that was new to me. One of my names, they said, was Microglossom, and this meant little tongue. It was most impertinent of them to discuss my tongue at all. How did they know I had one? He fluttered to the ground as he spoke and picked up a smooth triangular nut that lay at the foot of a very lofty tree. It was the kernel, he explained, of the canary nut, and his chief food, though he was very fond of fruit. "See if you can crack it," he cried, handling it over slyly. "If you can, it's yours. If you can't, it belongs to me." Conrad bit it as hard as he could with his strong white teeth, but for all the impression he made on it, the kernel might have been of iron. He placed it on the polished stump of a tree and tried to crack it with a heavy stone, but all in vain. Aratou picked it up again with a shrill whistle of pleasure. "And now I'll show you," he said, "that nature knew what she was about when she gave me what I expect you call in your own mind my funny beak, as the lorries do. We black cockatoos are the only birds in the forest who can break these nuts, and that is why we manage to live in spite of our greedy cousins, those screaming white cockatoos who have been trying to attract your notice ever since you came. They are bigger and stronger than we are, and drive us away from the fruit, but with all their strength they cannot get at these kernels, and now they leave them alone." Taking the nut sideways in his bill, Aratou sawed a notch in it with the sharp edge of his lower mandible, and then held it with his foot while he bit off a piece of leaf. I will wrap the knot so that it cannot slip, he explained as he placed the leaf in the notch of his upper mandible and struck the nut inside it. While holding it thus, he fixed the edge of his lower mandible in the notch and cleverly nipped off a piece of the shell. Now that the sharp point of his bill came into use, he dug out the soft kernel with this in triumph, drawing it into his mouth with his long, narrow tongue, which Conrad noticed was quite unlike that of any other parrot that he had seen. Aratu finished this dainty with deep satisfaction before answering Conrad's question. "Have I ever met a white merle?" he said. "No, my friend, I haven't. And if I had," Conrad's eagerness was evidently arousing his suspicions, "I would not betray her secret. What do you want with her?" Conrad told him the story of the White Merle's song. "It's a pretty fancy," Aratu said indulgently. "I do not think that you will find her here, but you can try. How's this for singing, eh?" He whistled not untunefully and was answered by his mate, who took that opportunity of reminding him that she did not think he was behaving well in leaving her alone while he talked to strangers. Before he returned to his duties, he advised Conrad to seek some shelter at once. "The rain will come soon," he said, and Gladheart, who had nestled out of sight as usual, was equally sure of this. Even as he twittered his fears, a few heavy drops splashed through the leaves, and Conrad hastened still further into the forest. Here, high in a very lofty tree, he saw a little green arbour on a forked bough, and took possession of it at once. "I wonder who has made it, and what it is for," he said to Gladheart, as he looked through the spaces that had evidently been left on purpose in the little panoply of palm leaves. "No good, no good," screamed a parrot shrilly, and in the crash of the storm the rest of his speech was lost. The thunder roared and the lightning flashed, but Conrad was very tired. Once more the rush of the wind through the topmost boughs was his lullaby, and his rest was sweet. At dawn he awoke. From the dim light of the forest he fancied at first that it was still night, but the birds around him were already stirring, and quivering shafts of light forced their way through the clustering branches. As he stretched himself sleepily, a desolate cry of "Work, work, work" that he had heard already rang through his ears again, and there flashed before him something so lovely that he held his breath. It was surely the trail of a shooting star, for the feathery streamers were of gold and orange, and were far too exquisite even for a bird. Another form flashed by him, and then another, each echoing that same strange cry. A little later, and two shimmering waves of light had stayed their flight to turn that moment into birds again, and dart at some hovering insects. Conrad could see now that the feathery cascade of golden plumes sprang from beneath their wings, and shaded off at the tips into the colour of hazelnuts. The rich deep brown of their underplumage deepened upon their breasts to a royal purple, and on their throats glowed the splendour of emeralds. "Those are the great birds of paradise, seeking their morning meal," whispered a familiar voice, and Aratu fluttered down and perched himself comfortably on Conrad's arm. "I have brought you a nut ready cracked," he added graciously, and his eyes twinkled as Conrad tried to make the tips of his fingers do the work of his own long tongue. Gladheart left them together. He had been concerned to notice that Conrad was growing thin, and reproached himself for not having seen that he was better supplied with fruit and berries. "Yes," said the cockatoo thoughtfully, as Conrad spoke of his wonder at the birds of paradise. "They are beautiful creatures, certainly, but none of us envy them. If you listen properly, I'll tell you why. But please don't interrupt." "It is said in the forest," he went on impressively, "that the first of these birds came from a garden in paradise to mate with a bird of earth, who had entranced him while he watched her from afar. The dew of heaven and the nectar of the flowers were all that he had asked or needed until then, and his voice was as sweet as the murmur of the waves on a moonlight night. But when he turned his thoughts to love, this did not satisfy him, and he offered his soul to a mermaid for the translucent green of the tail. The mermaid stole his sweet clear notes, but only tossed him in return a splash of green, and swaying with laughter, dived back to her coral caves. Determined to be beautiful at any cost, he stole the plumes of the sleeping sun god, and now at last he was ready to seek his mate. For a while all things went well with him, his wooing prospered, and he was as glad as the days were long. His children and his children's children grew and multiplied, until they made these islands theirs. But travellers came to our land at last, and when they saw the glory of the birds of paradise, they grew envious. Strange gifts of glittering drops of water that did not run, and sharp, long things that flashed like pale blue fire, and silenced all they touched, did they offer to those who would bring them the golden plumes, and though they returned at length to their own country, the evil had been done. The natives slay the birds of paradise by thousands now, and send them over the seas. It is only the males who are sacrificed, for their mates have no beauty to tempt man's greed, and so they are left to grieve alone. The isles of the forest are filled with their sad laments. Conrad was silent. He was thinking of a lovely lady who had once come to his father's studio to be painted, a lady with eyes as sweet as a dove's, and gracious and gentle ways. She had worn a dress of silvery stuff that gleamed softly as she moved, and behind a glittering coronet of diamonds, a golden plume trailed over her wavy hair. She would never have worn that plume, he thought, had she known what he knew now. Aratu drew his attention to the screen of palm leaves above his head. "It was put there by one of the natives," he explained, "to hide him from the birds of paradise, which he would slay. This is one of their dancing trees, and when they are in full plumage, as they are just now, they come to the upper branches to dance before their mates. That tall tree opposite, and the leaves are set far apart on the wide boughs, and there is plenty of space for the birds to play, is another that they are fond of using for their revels. If you sit still, quite you'll see them, for I hear them coming now. Shoo!" His long drawn whistle was full of concern. "There is a native there already, and he is on the watch." Following the direction of his eyes, Conrad saw in the tree before him a dusky form resting against one of the lower boughs, hidden by just the same arch of sheltering leaves as that above himself. The silent figure crouching against the dark brown bark held bow and arrows ready. As a flock of the great birds of paradise broke through the bank of green and alighted on the branches above him, he stealthily placed an arrow on his string. The birds of paradise were glad that morning. The rain had cooled the air, and each breath they drew was a rare delight. They quivered with joy at their own beauty. now darting from branch to branch, extending their shadowy wings in constant vibration, now pausing to expand the gorgeous plumes behind them into great golden fans tinged at their base with red. As the beauteous birds flamed to and fro, their emerald throats and amber eyes shone like fabled gems in their splendid setting. The sun god, who bore no malice for the daring robbery of his plumes, threw his radiance over them, and the gentle brown mates who watched them dance thrilled with love and pride. Silently the native released the arrow from his bow. The tip was covered with a large wooden cap, and as it struck the bird for which it was intended, the beautiful creature dropped down stunned. Another and yet another shared his fate, but the dance went on, the whirring, vibrating wings flashing in wildest rhythm. The excited birds did not realize what was happening. Many of them had been shot down, and their stiffening bodies seized by natives hidden in the thick grass, before any heed was given to the cries of their frantic mates. The sight of their distress and the beautiful golden plumage trailing on the ground, while cruel black fingers gripped the emerald throats, was more than Conrad could bear. In spite of the danger of being shot down himself, he unfurled his wings and dashed from his hiding place. The natives stared in wonder, but he had flown up into the blue before he could take aim. In a passion of pity he scarcely saw which way he went, but Gladheart guided him to another island, where the notes of the birds were still notes of joy, and nothing dimmed the brightness of the sunshine.